On 1st December 1955, a woman by the name of Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery. Her persecution and eventual arrest sparked a widespread movement which came to be known as the Civil Rights Movement. The question arises, what is so special about Rosa Parks? Why did her persecution and eventual arrest brought about such a large change in the social political system in the United States, which also had reverberating effects across the world? Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome to the 6th episode of Weekend Reads. In this episode, we'll be discussing the role of habits on larger societies and on larger communities. And we'll focus on how habits on the societal level can bring about social political changes. And we will look at it in the three distinct stages of how a social movement begins and endures. Social movements can be distilled into three basic steps. Number one, the beginning, in which an event happens that triggers a certain response and it creates a flare of action. Number two, the movement grows. In this stage, the movement spreads from the initial group of people to a larger community, to a larger society. And third, the movement endures. And in this stage, the leaders of that movement bring about certain changes by inculcating certain social habits within the community and giving a sense of identity to the participants, which helps the movement take up a life of its own and allows the people to mobilize on themselves. So let's begin from the first stage, the beginning. In this stage, the strong social ties of friendship are extremely important. And it can be understood very simply, right? If you have a close friend or a family member, and if they're grieved and you hear about that, you are pushed to act, often without thinking. Why do we act? अगर हमारे करीब कोई इंसान है जिसको कोई तकलीफ़ है या कोई मुश्किल में है, आप ऑटोमेटिकली उसकी मदद करने के लिए आते हैं किसी भी तरीके से, या एटलीस्ट आपको बुरा ज़रूर लगता है. वो क्यों लगता है? Why do you have this obligation on you to feel bad? It is because it's the social habits of friendship. It is the obligation you have to that person. For most people, their social circle is limited to the group of people they hang out with, which is usually limited to their social class or their racial identity, especially in those days. But Rosa Parks was different. She was deeply embedded in the social fabric of the Montgomery community. So one thing that she had that other people who were being persecuted at that time did not have was strong social ties of friendship that cut across social and racial lines. Because she was an individual who was largely liked by anyone who knew her, there was a lot of support for her and a lot of people felt bad to what she had to experience. जिसकी वजह से there was this initial spark where there was this protest and people decided that we're going to boycott the buses. And that's where the initial spark happened, and that sort of gave the strong initial push that the movement needed. But protests तो हर जगह होते हैं, social movements आती हैं जाती हैं, social actions हर जगह आते जाते हैं. हर action जो है वो एक social movement के अंदर तब्दील नहीं होता. Not every protest leads to a larger response. Why in this case was it that it endured and it took a life of its own? And here the second stage comes into play where the movement grows. And in this stage, it is the weak ties of community that become important. Weak ties is simply the relations you have with people by virtue of being part of that community. For example, आप यूनिवर्सिटी की एग्जांपल लें, आप यूनिवर्सिटी में किसी क्लब या सोसाइटी का हिस्सा हैं. अब आप उस क्लब सोसाइटी के हर मेंबर को नहीं जानते, बट बिकॉज यू आर पार्ट ऑफ दैट कम्युनिटी, बिकॉज यू पार्ट ऑफ दैट सोसाइटी, तो कहीं ना कहीं एक शेयर्ड आइडेंटिटी, एक शेयर्ड लिंक बन जाता है. दैट इज़ दैट वीक कनेक्शन. In this particular case, what happened was those weak ties of community took hold. Weak ties of community के अंदर क्या होता है? There is a very important element that comes into power, which is peer pressure. For instance, there's a black neighborhood that learns about that there's this black woman who had faced persecution and she was subjected to segregation and all of that. So that black neighborhood, by virtue of being associated to that black lady because they share ethnicity and they belong to the same race, they are now pushed to act. There is that peer pressure. Now let's say if there are about 10 people living in a neighborhood, 8 or 9 of them decide that we have to participate because of similar identity, because they can relate with it, and there's one person who decides that they're not going to participate. Imagine the kind of social backlash that that one person would face by not participating in the protest. Now, because of this peer pressure, people were willing to take on a lot of pains as well. Participating in a social movement is no joke. It requires a lot of sacrifice on your part. For instance, people decided that they're not going to go by buses, they're going to go by by themselves. They're going to walk to their workplaces, or they're going to take cabs, or they're going to do carpooling, all of that. All of these sometimes would also result in some delays because the state was also acting. The state did not want this movement to succeed, so there was a lot of persecution by police officers of people who were gathering in common carpooling areas, and the state also placed a minimum fare that had to be charged, and any taxi driver who was not charging that fare was also fined. So all of these things were done, which created an inconvenience for the people who were participating in that movement. But because of that peer pressure, people continued. But peer pressure only functions till a certain extent. There comes a point where the nuisance that is being created by state suppression becomes too much for people, and they can no longer continue to be part of that social movement. This is where the third stage comes into play, where we say the movement endures. How does the movement endure? Now, one of the leaders of this movement was Martin Luther King. You've all heard about him. And Martin Luther King was finding it very difficult to motivate people, to encourage people to stay on course to continue the boycott of the buses, because every day people were calling him that they're getting late to their offices, they're being persecuted by police officers, they're facing all kinds of problems. Something had to give way, and something eventually did give way. When MLK was talking to a gathering, and somebody informed him that a bomb has gone off at his residence. Now, when he went there, nobody was hurt, but there was a large number of black people that had gathered over there. MLK seized this opportunity, and he told the people that we're going to protest in a non-violent manner. The other thing he said was, we have to strive for equality. In that particular statement, he changed the entire outlook of the social movement. This was now about a larger struggle for the civil rights and equality for all American citizens. It expanded the scope of the entire social movement. So people now had greater resolve to withstand the persecution, to withstand the onslaught from the government, because they felt that this was now closer to their home. This was something that was directly affecting them, and it gave the participants a new identity. The third thing it did was it inculcated certain social habits within the members of the social movement. They are now going to protest in a non-violent manner, and they're going to gather, organize themselves in a non-violent manner. Up until then, MLK had to drive the action. He needed new leaders to emerge who could self-organize at community level, at church level. New social leaders emerged at the grassroots level, where they would organize within their neighborhood, within the community. They would hold talks, they would hold sessions. As the state continued to persecute the movement leaders, people would automatically go there, sit there, record their peaceful protest, and go. MLK no longer needed to be everywhere at all times. So he gave two things to the social movement. He gave them a new identity, a larger struggle for civil rights, and number two, he gave them a new habit in how to organize within themselves, organize at the local level, and that's how the movement endured. And we can use the concepts that we've learned today to understand the current social and political movement that is going on around the world, which is on the humanitarian issue that is created in Palestine, which is not just a social issue, it's also a political issue. And we've seen how people are boycotting those companies that are in some ways linked to the oppressing Israeli government. How are these people mobilizing themselves? There's no one person that is leading the movement. There are certain organizations that are pushing out content, that are creating a narrative, sure, but people are doing this. People are continuing this boycott on themselves, by themselves, because they feel that there is a social obligation. Most of the people living in Pakistan do not have any direct links with the people of Palestine, other than the fact that there is this link with that place, because we hold it very close to us because of religious reasons, but also because that there's this sense of supporting the people who are victims of a vicious oppression by a tyrant government. But other than that, there's no primary links to it. It's the weak ties of larger community which we can expand to the global level that is existing, and that is why there are people who are boycotting. That is why people are discussing about not associating themselves in any shape or form with companies that are linked with the Israeli government. discussing this issue in our families, family gatherings, amongst friend circles, that we are raising awareness, that we are fighting in that struggle. And I think this is, in a way, we are part of a larger political movement. We are part of a larger social movement in which we are ensuring that we can do as much as we can in order to sustain the social movement. People think that me acting alone is not having a lot of impact, but we're not acting alone. We might be acting in our individual capacity, but we are part of a larger movement. With this, we conclude our discussion on this book, Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. This was a very interesting book. I have learned personally a lot from it. I highly recommend it. It has amazing lessons for all of us. In the next episode, we'll be looking at another book. So if you have any suggestions, mention them in the comment section below. Thank you, and Allah Hafiz.